Happy weekend. I'm Ari Melber. Let's get right into the headlines.
Welcome to The Beat. I'm Katie Fang, in for Ari Melber. We're still coming to terms with the fallout from Monday's Supreme Court decision vastly expanding the powers of the president. Trump seizing on the decision, which bolsters and, even worse, legally protects his worst impulses, while his allies tout the authoritarian future that they want to build if Trump wins again. Tonight, one of them raising alarms for saying the quiet part out loud.
We are going to win. We're in the process of taking this country back. We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
That ominous warning was from Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, the right-wing think tank that created Project 2025, a 900-page extremist blueprint for a possible second Trump term. The outline includes detailed plans to expand presidential powers even more, including restructuring the Department of Justice, purging federal government employees and replacing them with tens of thousands of Trump loyalists, dismantling the Department of Education, and banning abortion medication. The Heritage Foundation leader has not been shy about promoting this plan.
President Trump is going to make decisions about policy in his administration if he wins. Project 2025 is something that's going to transcend the next 4 years, the next 10 years. We're going to fire someone, and the number needs to be more than 50,000. Abortion is not health care. We need to have the biggest mass deportation system ever in the history of America.
Roberts' promise of a, quote, revolution, underscoring the very real threat of authoritarianism corrupting American democracy. Words that ricochet throughout the MAGA movement and from Trump himself.
I am your warrior. I am your justice. And for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. I said I want to be a dictator for one day. We will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country.
Lock up the Bidens. Lock up Hillary.
If I don't get elected, it's going to be a bloodbath. Proud Boys, stand back and stand by. It's nice to have a strong man running your country.
Joining me now is Dr. Jason Johnson, politics professor at Morgan State University and the host of A Word with Jason Johnson, and Ruth Ben-Ghiat, history professor at NYU and an expert on authoritarian dictators. My thanks to both of you on the eve of a holiday for joining us. Jason, I'd like to start with you. Your thoughts about this new warning from Project 2025.
Well, it's interesting, Katie. The key part about this, I was actually interviewing your friend and mine, Elie Mystal, earlier today on my podcast. We were talking about Project 2025, and he said something very interesting. He said, of all the things in the 900 pages, what Project 2025 doesn't talk about is the Supreme Court. Why? Because they already have it, right? So what we saw on Monday, what we heard on Monday was this sort of final step of what has been a 25-year plan on the part of the American right to take over this country. So I wasn't shocked by the decision. I'm not shocked by 2025. I'm more shocked by an administration and a Democratic Party that hasn't been ringing the alarm bells about this and the way that they should. And here's the thing. Even if Joe Biden is reelected this fall, and right now that's still my guess, get back to me after Labor Day. But even if he's reelected, Project 2025 just moves down the hill. Unless we break the backs of these fascists, this will be something hanging over this country for the next generation.
You know, Ruth, I know you've been sounding this alarm for a long time, to your credit. Does Project 2025, for context for our viewers, have any historical parallels? I mean, in the present sense, Ruth, I look at Donald Trump and I see that his idols are Putin and Orban and other authoritarians like that. And so I presume that this is not some brilliant idea that was just born out of that, quote unquote, beautiful mind of Donald Trump.
No, Project 2025 is they have learned from other autocrats. One of the most, alarming things, though, is, and they state this, is that, the first Trump administration, they weren't able to do everything they wanted to do, and they got a slow start, Roberts has said. So their code word is day one, where they've got all these already politically vetted people in place that they're going to immediately seek to implement their executive orders and other plans. And one thing it's very important for people to realize, and you showed Trump in these clips, So Project 2025 talks about having mass deportations of over 10 million immigrants, undocumented immigrants, but it's always more people. And Trump was talking about the political opposition, Marxists, fascists. So they use one group to have the justification to build the repressive infrastructure, like the camps, the transit camps, whatever they're going to do. But be assured, and this is the history of authoritarianism, many groups of people will be, targeted to be in them.
Jason, Kevin Roberts, the head of the Heritage Foundation, later responded that, quote, these patriots are committed to peaceful revolution at the ballot box. But, Jason, we've seen what happens when they lose. We know what they do when they lose. So are they warning very publicly that there's going to be another January 6th?
They're not warning, Katie. They told us already.
Yeah.
They told us on January 6th. They told us when Abbott decided that he wanted to pardon someone who shot protesters. They've told us when Kyle Rittenhouse is still walking through the streets. It is not a political party. It is an ongoing violent coup. I have said for a long time that I suspect there will be violence even before the election. So I think the problem, the fear that people need to have is not just, oh, gosh, what would happen if Donald Trump actually beat Joe Biden and got into the White House? The question would be how much random violence. We're not talking state-sponsored violence. How much random violence will be inflicted upon anybody in this country who is deemed to be an enemy that will suddenly be absolutely excused by the administration? That's what people need to be concerned about. We're not just talking about bad feelings. We're not just talking about people getting kicked out of the country. We're talking about people being shot in the street by cops who say they're acting on the orders of President Donald Trump, and him and his Department of Justice saying, yeah, we deputized him. It happened 15 minutes after he murdered that guy, but we're good with it. That's what we're facing. It's not hyperbole.
Yeah, and that's important to note because, Ruth, one thing that struck me when I've looked at the Project 2025 blueprint and I've read the plan that it sets forth, it's interesting. They actually don't target it for Donald Trump per se. So you could actually plug and play any GOP leader who managed to take the Oval. But let's be very clear, though. To make the Project 2025 plan work the most effectively, the most ruthlessly, you got to have somebody like Donald Trump, right? You got to have somebody who doesn't have morals, an ethical compass, or any type of scruples. And so in this instance, it's not just who sits in the Oval, but it's that pre-screening you talked about and that Jason talks about. This idea that you're kind of building it from the ground up so they're ready to deploy. They are on the ready to go starting in January of 2025.
Yeah, but you also need somebody who has cultivated over time a cult following. And you need somebody with a personality cult like Trump, because what he did on January 6th, let's not forget, he called himself a victim. He said that the election had been stolen from him. And he said, if you don't fight like hell, you won't have a country anymore. And when you have a large group of followers who feel existentially threatened, if they lose their leader. And what else does Donald Trump say? He says, they're not going after me, they're going after you. So on January 6th, he assembled them, and then he, incited them to have violence on his behalf, but they were also saving him. This was their dear leader. They were saving him from an unjust fate. So it's a very volatile and explosive situation when you have people like these are like what Hannah Arendt called the desk killers, the people like Roberts who are in the suits and who are partnering with people like Steve Bannon with, you need both of these people and you need the cult leader. And so all the pieces are coming together now in this time, and it's extremely dangerous. The last thing I'll say is it was interesting. Roberts said that the revolution will be bloodless if the left allows it to be. And he's speaking as the head of a think tank, and I'm not aware that Heritage has its own paramilitary or in-house security apparatus large enough to have a revolution on a national scale. So he's telling you that they are aligned with militias and whoever else is going to actually do the bloodletting if the left doesn't submit. So that's very interesting, too, if you study authoritarianism.
Well, and it's interesting, Ruth, you stole my thunder of your thunder, because I actually had that tweet that you just put up about the fact that you need to have that military apparatus to be able to effectuate what you're planning to do. Jason, something that's been driving me nuts about this latest criticisms of Joe Biden is the fact that people seem to have really short memories, because Trump's first term was hardly marked by restraint. I mean, take a quick listen here. This is former Secretary of Defense Mark Esper talking about Trump's approach to protesters in the summer of 2020. Take a quick listen.
He's going to finally give a direct order to deploy paratroopers into the streets of Washington, D.C., and I'm thinking with weapons and bayonets. And this would be horrible.
What specifically was he suggesting that the U.S. military should do to these protesters?
He says, can't you just shoot them? Just shoot them in the legs or something.
Jason, there were some people that served, theoretically, I guess, as guardrails during Trump's first term. But one of my biggest fears is, and one I want to ask you about, is there going to be anyone in Trump's orbit that will stop him a second time around?
Look, the guardrails were made with silly string and cellophane last time. I mean, they weren't really stopping him. The only thing that stopped him was his own incompetence and inability to move forward with a policy idea. This is what I think is important, Katie, for everybody to understand about this. There is nothing that this president cannot and will not do next time. And I want everybody to understand this going forward, because there's a whole lot of screaming and crying and fears and everything else like right now about Joe Biden. I want to make it clear. He's probably going to be the nominee. And if you don't like everything we're talking about that Donald Trump is going to do, that's the guy you got to line up behind. I think in the face of fascism, in the face of an authoritarian regime, spending the next 3.5 months arguing about who's the first person to take the hit from that administration is not going to be a good idea. We have to work with who we've got now. I wish they were better. Everybody wishes they were better. But Joe Biden might be the only person right now that can stop this authoritarian regime from coming to power. And I think people are being very naive if they're saying that they think we can do a switch halfway through this battle and stop this impending war that these folks have been preparing for 25 years.
Ruth Ben-Ghiat, Jason Johnson, thanks so much for getting us started. Coming up, big news about Trump's criminal sentencing. Donald Trump today using his Supreme Court win to his litigation advantage, scoring a delay for his New York criminal sentencing, which was originally scheduled for next week. But Judge Juan Merchan now pushing back the sentencing by more than 2 months, noting in a letter it will be September 18th at the earliest, quote, if such is still necessary. Now, that's only days before the first Americans will head to the polls for early voting. This while Trump's lawyers are fighting to have his New York election interference conviction thrown out based on yesterday's ruling granting him presidential immunity for, quote, official acts. His lawyers arguing that New York prosecutors improperly used evidence from Trump's time as president in their case. But prosecutors say that Trump's claim that the Supreme Court's decision should vacate his 34 felony convictions is, quote, without merit. Still, the immunity ruling could provide a roadblock for prosecutors in Trump's other cases, limiting what evidence they can use in court. Yesterday's majority opinion reading in part, quote, testimony or private records of the president or his advisors probing such conduct may not be admitted as evidence at trial. The evidence presented during the New York trial did include some of Trump's social media posts from his first term and witness testimony regarding events in the Oval Office, namely checks being signed by Donald Trump. There's also the question of what counts as an official act. Trump's lawyers already publicly arguing that this ruling should nullify the other cases against him.
Alternate slates of electors have been a method used by previous presidents, most notably Ulysses S. Grant, to ensure the integrity of prior elections. So we believe the assembly of those alternate slates of electors was an official act.
Joining me now to make it all make sense, Joyce Vance, former U.S. attorney, MSNBC legal analyst, and a senior fellow at the Brennan Center, and Ankush Khardori, former federal prosecutor and a senior writer with Politico. Two of some of my favorite folks. Joyce, let's start with you. I mean, Trump legal's like drinking from a fire hose. Just when you think that we're able to move on, something drops like today. Your thoughts on how Trump's motion to vacate those convictions will play out in New York? Judge Merchan has indicated that he would rule on any motion by Donald Trump by September 6th.
Right. So, look, I think what we're seeing is a good process here. It's important that the judge is giving the parties time to brief the issues so that he can fully explore them and create a record. We all know that that's the basis of good lawyering here. Where it ends, I'm not quite certain yet. I think one of the problems that we're seeing is that these proceedings in New York expose a real problem in the Supreme Court's opinion by creating this very, I think, uncomfortable and expansive distinction between official and unofficial conduct. They've really ignored and bypassed this notion that Donald Trump blurred the lines and was in many ways committing conduct related to the campaign and his private businesses from the Oval Office. So how Judge Merchan will sort that out, I think we'll find out when he takes in these briefings and issues an opinion. But my hunch is that this should not impact the New York case in ways it may impact some of the other federal cases.
Yeah, and Ankush, to Joyce's point, I mean, you don't anticipate some heavily fact-intensive inquiry by Judge Merchan based upon what Trump's lawyers are threatening to file in terms of the motion to set aside, right?
I don't, and I agree with Joyce's assessment in terms of there needing to be sort of a bit of a process to let the judge analyze the decision, let the parties weigh in. I wouldn't expect anything in the way of a fact-intensive inquiry simply because there's a trial record, right? And I think the parties can and should be working from that in order to sort of make their arguments. But I also agree with Joyce. I mean, so far as the evidence at that trial seemed to indicate, none of the real core conduct that was at issue really related to Trump's official conduct. It pertained to his personal dealings, to his campaign for the presidency, and to his business to some extent. But I have a hard time seeing why, signing checks in the Oval Office should properly be considered an official act. I'm sure Trump's lawyers will be arguing all of that, and they've already begun, as you noted. But this issue was sort of flagged in the run-up to the trial. The parties were aware of it. And the judge considered some of it. So it's not coming totally out of left field, and I do think there will be a sort of an orderly resolution to it.
Yeah, my 2 cents, I think Judge Merchan denies the motion, sentences Donald Trump, and then it ends up being an issue on the appeal. But there's also the cumulative evidence that was presented in the prosecution's case in chief against Donald Trump. It's not just what they're saying on the defense's side were the, quote, official acts evidence that they think was particularly wrong to use. Joyce, you did mention a couple of minutes ago other cases. In the immunity decision, Justice Amy Coney Barrett wrote that she thinks that fake elector scheme for Trump can be prosecuted. She said, quote, take the president's alleged attempt to organize alternative slates of electors. In my view, that conduct is private and therefore not entitled to protection. I mean, I'm asking you to read some tea leaves here, Joyce, on the fly a little bit, but do you see the fake electors case as still being allowed to go forward?
Well, that's 4 votes, I suppose, and we don't know if there's a 5th vote that will join her. No one joined in that concurrence point of view. But look, there has to be some sort of a rational basis here. The Supreme Court talks about core executive branch conduct, and that's conduct that stems from a president's constitutional or at least lawful powers granted to him by Congress. And then there's this much broader range, they sort of characterize it as a twilight zone of official conduct, and that's maybe official adjacent or something that impacts other official conduct. And when we get to the point where we're talking about creating fake slates of electors in order to steal an election that you've lost, I have enormous difficulty seeing that as an official power of the presidency. So I'm hoping that despite this opinion, the courts will right-size themselves and permit prosecutions like those involving the fake slates of electors to move forward.
Yeah, so Ankush, I wanted to talk to you about something that keeps on kind of flying below the radar because there's so much meat on that bone from yesterday's ruling, but I'm particularly concerned about Justice Thomas's concurrence, wherein he attacks the validity of the appointment of special counsel Jack Smith. Obviously, Jack Smith is at the helm of not only the federal election interference case in D.C., but also the federal case that's being prosecuted in my state of Florida in front of Judge Eileen Cannon. Your thoughts about the future of Jack Smith on these cases as a special counsel?
Yeah, you're right to be concerned that may sort of be a template for future decisions, potentially from Judge Cannon, potentially even from the Supreme Court. I mean, we are living in a time when Justice Thomas's lone opinions, lone dissents from years ago are becoming the law. This is not a position that the majority disavowed. Reading Justice Thomas's opinion, I find it quite mangled and quite hard to accept, quite honestly, I think, as legal reasoning. But it wouldn't surprise me if that opinion has legs, if Judge Cannon latches onto it, or even if the Supreme Court, if it has to confront this issue at a later date again, decides that that is an issue they want to weigh into as well.
Joyce, I have less than a minute, but I did want to get your take on that as well, because I do think that Cannon has, I know Cannon has yet to rule on the motion to dismiss based on the appointment of Jack Smith that's pending down in Florida. And my fear is Judge Thomas gratuitously added that concurrence, didn't address really anything else, and said, come on, Eileen, bring on your granting of that motion to dismiss.
Yeah, there was no reason for Justice Thomas to write this concurrence. The only thing positive I can say about it is that he didn't pick up any votes to join him on it. This is not an issue that was briefed. It was flagged briefly in oral argument, but it's not really something that needed to be decided here. And judges don't decide issues that aren't before them. So clearly this is just a bone he's throwing to Judge Cannon. Now she can cite the concurrence and use that to justify her ruling.
Oh, you guys are supposed to give good news. Joyce Vance and Kush Kardori, thank you both for being here. I'm kidding. Thank you for your excellent analysis, as always. Thanks for being here. Still ahead, new details on the DOJ's plan to push Ford to hold Trump to account. The Supreme Court this week handing Donald Trump a considerable win, ruling that presidents are immune from prosecution for any, quote, official acts, effectively stalling Trump's federal coup case, now extremely unlikely to go to trial ahead of November.
The full scope of the evidence and a jury verdict is just so unlikely to happen before the election.
This trial is going to get slowed down prohibitively over a matter of months.
The notion that this is going to get to trial in that amount of time just seems vanishingly unlikely.
But the ruling does open the door for trial judge Tanya Chutkan to hold evidentiary hearings. The justice is remanding allegations of Jack Smith's indictment back to the D.C. court to determine if they qualify for immunity. The New York Times saying that this could lead to, quote, something extraordinary, a mini trial in the home stretch of the presidential campaign. Now, it's unclear when the hearing might take place, but it would give prosecutors the opportunity to present their case before Election Day. And the D.C. coup case isn't the only case affected by this Supreme Court ruling. A judge postponing Trump's felony conviction sentencing in New York until September, as his lawyers argue to toss the verdict entirely in the wake of Monday's immunity opinion. Joining me now for more is Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren of California. She was a member of the January 6th Select Committee. Congresswoman, it's an honor to have you here, as always. I'd like to get your reaction to that Supreme Court decision on Monday.
Well, it's extraordinary. And as I was mentioning to Nicole earlier in the week, the Supreme Court basically answered the question that was posed at the oral argument. Can the president send SEAL Team 6 to assassinate his political enemies? And the answer they gave is yes. If it's a core responsibility of the presidency, they said that the president is immune. Now, that's not a defense. It means he can't be charged. And although they didn't specify in every case what that was, there's nothing more, if you look at the Constitution, nothing more core than Article 2, Section 2, the president shall be the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy. Now, I said something to Katie that certain right-wingers have distorted, and I want to make sure it's clear. The ability of a president to use his authority as commander-in-chief to send assassins is clearly approved by the court, whether it's somebody going to assassinate judges, your neighbor, political rivals, whoever. That doesn't mean I'm in favor of that. In fact, I'm appalled by that. And I think every American thinks that kind of activity should be criminal. And it was until Monday.
Yeah, and to your point, Congresswoman, it's that conduct that's appalling, as you note accurately, that's now been cloaked by this idea that it's an official act, and so you can't actually even get into it in terms of the motivation, according to the Supreme Court. As I noted, there's this talk of an evidentiary hearing. I really was interested in getting your take on this, because from your work on the January 6th committee, do you believe that there's actually more evidence? I mean, we haven't seen the arsenal of evidence, I think, that special counsel Jack Smith has, that the public, the American public, hasn't been privy to that may affect the outcome of this case.
Well, there were things we couldn't get because witnesses refused to come in. Mr. Bannon is in jail right now because he refused to testify, and I think he knows a lot. Mark Meadow refused to testify. He knows a lot. So I don't know how much, and others as well, I don't know how much the special prosecutor has in terms of testimony from those individuals. And of course, the court went further than even Justice Amy Coney Barrett suggested. They can't even use evidence related to sort of core functions. But that doesn't mean they can't have a hearing. In fact, they're going to have a hearing to decide what can be used, what can't be used, what is immune, what is arguably immune and presumptively immune. So it's a mess, but it's going to be a very detailed evidentiary process that absolutely has to be held.
And, you know, I just want to ask a follow-up on that, because for me, as I know for others, watching the public hearings that you conducted as a part of that select committee, letting Americans get a bird's eye view not only into the live testimony that was provided during these hearings, but even the videotape depositions that you guys did was exceptionally powerful. It was impactful. Do you think that it will have just as much of an impact on American voters as we get closer to November, assuming arguendo these evidentiary hearings take place before then?
Well, it's hard to know. I mean, for one thing, proceedings in federal district court are not televised, and so there'll be a written account. I think the fact that the witnesses we had were seen and heard was powerful, although the transcripts were equally powerful in some cases. So, you know, it's hard to know what impact any of this will. You know, some of the supporters of the ex-president really are not interested in facts. They're on Earth too. It really, as some of my colleagues have said, it's a cult. But I think that's not most Americans. Most Americans want to vote in the best interests of our country for someone who will do a good and steady job and think about the future of our country and our democracy. That's what most people want.
Yeah, I'm glad that you noted, Congresswoman, as I have to part from you, that there is no video or audio that's going to come out of federal court, but we also didn't have video and audio out of that New York election interference case in front of Judge Merchan, and that one definitely had an impact on Americans in terms of their views. But Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, thank you for your service, and thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. Still ahead, Steve Bannon reporting to prison with some parting words about the future of MAGA. Today, on a different bid for accountability, Steve Bannon reporting to federal prison in Connecticut for defying a January 6th committee subpoena. He's sentenced to 4 months, meaning Bannon will get out just days before the November 5th election. Bannon is the second Trump ally convicted for criminal contempt of Congress, along with Peter Navarro. Bannon recently spoke to NBC's Vaughn Hilliard, vowing retaliation.
In his Justice Department to do what they should do, to start investigations of how the Justice Department weaponized the legal system against the MAGA movement and President Trump and his followers. There's going to be plenty of time for that.
Joining me now is Josh Green, national correspondent with Bloomberg and the author of Devil's Bargain, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the storming of the presidency. Josh, it's good to have you here. As we speak, you and I, Steve Bannon is literally, finally, behind bars. Your reaction?
You know, my first reaction is it sort of makes the book's title, Devil's Bargain, feel even more poignant. You know, what I wrote about back then was sort of how this partnership had come together. But I say in the book that most of Donald Trump's business partners end up unhappy. And here Steve Bannon is headed off to federal prison. But that being said, you know, he's, as he is prone to do, turned it into a media circus. He's using it, I think, to try and amplify and enhance his brand. And, you know, every indication he's given publicly is that this is a great thing and sort of furthers his story, as we heard in that clip, that the Biden Justice Department is somehow persecuting Trump-friendly Republicans.
Yeah, and so, Josh, we hear Bannon's vow several times, including right then with Von Hilliard, that the retaliation is the plan. I mean, plain as day, right? They don't try to hide it. And yet, your thoughts now, considering what the Supreme Court just ruled today in terms of this kind of cloak of official acts being able to be used to provide immunity. So if retaliation is the name of the game, it sounds like the Supreme Court just said, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, here you go.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, usually when Bannon says these kind of things, he's looking to provoke a reaction. He's looking to get media attention. I'm pretty sure that was the case here. Certainly, Trump would have more leeway to retaliate if that's what he decides to he wants to do if he gets elected. But I do think for Bannon, like the fact that he's going off to jail is sort of not the way he would write the script himself if he could. But the fact that it's only a 4-month sentence, it could have been longer. I was talking to an ally of his before the sentencing who said, listen, if the sentence is less than 6 months, what I expect is for Bannon to sort of treat himself as if he were Nelson Mandela, a political prisoner. And sure enough, that's what we saw on the steps of the prison today as he was going in, putting himself into this narrative of Trump MAGA world persecution, which I think he believes will enhance his brand, will enhance the image of him as loyal foot soldier to Trump. You know, and ultimately redound to his benefit, at least in a kind of media MAGA world sense.
And then there's this idea, Steve Bannon telling Von Hilliard that Donald Trump is a moderate, using the phrase moderate when it comes to MAGA. And yet, to the point that you just made, Peter Navarro, Steve Bannon, some of the 1-6 riders, right? They're the only ones that are doing jail time for a moderate Donald Trump?
Well, you know, I think when you look at what's going on here, you know, Bannon taking pride in the fact that he'd been sentenced to prison, it's almost as if prison time has become a new badge of honor or a sort of mark of loyalty to you know, true fealty to Donald Trump. Navarro had said he doesn't want to be pardoned. He doesn't want to be let out early. You know, Bannon is referring to himself as a political prisoner. I think, you know, as these things become more extreme, as some of these MAGA followers become, you know, ever more extreme in what they're doing, this is just another marker of how far out of the norm things have skewed. That somebody who was his campaign director, who was a chief White House strategist, is now heading into a federal prison. And is okay with it.
Celebrating it, in fact. Joshua Green, thanks for being here for the latest on Steve Bannon. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
At least Donald Trump's allies are being held accountable. Former Trump lawyer, Rudy Giuliani can no longer practice law in the state of New York. A state appeals court disbarring him for spreading lies about the 2020 election. In the ruling, they say Giuliani, quote, baselessly attacked and undermined the integrity of this country's electoral process. And he, quote, actively contributed to the national strife that has followed the 2020 presidential election, for which he is entirely unrepentant. This comes just a day after Steve Bannon reported to prison following in the footsteps of former Trump aide Peter Navarro. They are just a few of many Trump allies facing accountability for trying to overturn the election.
In Arizona, for example, the Democratic Attorney General has indicted 18 people. Rudy Giuliani, Boris Epstein, John Eastman, Mark Meadows.
Yes, I was part of the process to make sure there were alternate electors.
Steve Bannon reported to prison today to serve out his 4-month sentence for defying a congressional subpoena.
I am proud to go to prison. Trump advisor Peter Navarro was sentenced to 4 months in prison.
I'm pissed.
A jury ordering Rudy Giuliani to pay $148 million in damages to 2 Georgia elections workers.
Of course I don't regret it. I told the truth.
Still ahead, Ellie Ying-Mastal is here on the credibility crisis that continues to face the Supreme Court after one of its most controversial terms. The fallout from the Supreme Court's immunity ruling spreading far and wide, with many expressing shock and fear about what it means for the future of the presidency.
To that now infamous question of whether a president can order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, the United States Supreme Court said, in effect, yeah, maybe.
You can do whatever you want, and the Supreme Court is probably going to let you get away with it. That is very frightening.
Could the president actually start putting pardons on eBay for $1 million?
If he's president, he's likely to read this ruling as a kind of all guardrails are off.
Could a president take a bribe with impunity, with immunity?
Sure looks like it.
To put it in Game of Thrones terms, America now has a king and 6 hands of the king.
The New York Times noting this immunity ruling reflects just how far the court's conservative majority has gone in endorsing Trump's view of politics as a no-holds-barred battle for power. Now, as the Supreme Court faces a mounting credibility crisis and a conservative supermajority roiled by ethics scandals, the chorus of calls for reform are getting louder. Joining me now is Elie Ying-Mistal, justice correspondent for The Nation, the author of Allow Me to Retort, a Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Elie, you got a job to do. I think we got to write yet another book, or maybe 10, because I'm not quite sure what's left of our Constitution these days. I read your latest piece on what happened on Monday. My question to you was supposed to be what worries you the most about this immunity ruling, and yet I feel like we already know what the answer is, huh?
I want to know who's surprised. Honestly, I want to know who hasn't been paying enough attention to the Supreme Court that they're actually surprised that they went this far. I want all of the institutionalists to be lined up in front of me so they can apologize to me and America for gaslighting people for the past 3 decades about what these conservatives were actually about, because people like me have been trying to scream it from the rooftops for years at this point. The Supreme Court is, the conservative-controlled Supreme Court is 100% involved in a massive power grab. What they are trying to do is remake the rules of American democracy so that unelected, unaccountable judges hold all the power and the voters hold none, even in the immunity decision, right? And I know immunity, it's creating the presidency as an office of king. It's giving extreme power to the executive. But think carefully about what the court actually did there, right? What they did is that they tried to separate out the difference between unofficial and official acts, right? They didn't give any guidance about what those acts might be. They didn't give any guidance so that we, the people, might understand the difference between official and unofficial acts. They just said, yeah, there's probably a difference, but everything Trump did was most likely official. Well, what does that mean? That means going forward that the only people who know whether or not a president is able to commit crimes is not the president, it's the Supreme Court. With the Chevron case, as we saw, the only people who know what regulations we are allowed or not allowed to have is the Supreme Court. The only people who know what laws are constitutional or unconstitutional is the Supreme Court, not Congress, not the president, and not the voters. That is the point. That is the through line from everything that we've seen from the Supreme Court, not only this past week, but over the past 10 or so years. And that's where we are in this country, with a court that is completely overpowered and a court that understands we, the people, and we, the Democratic Party, lack the strength to do squadouche to stop them.
You know, in that majority opinion in the ruling, Chief Justice Roberts argued that the hesitation to execute the duties of his office fearlessly and fairly under a pall of potential prosecution raises unique risks to the effective functioning of government. Elie, since when is criminal deterrence a bad thing?
Right? Like, remember, this is about what Trump did while he thought he could be prosecuted after the fact for his crimes. Can you imagine what he's going to do now that he knows that he can't be prosecuted for crimes? And the idea that the president needs to act so quickly, boldly, and without reason, that criming is just a thing that might happen, that God forbid the president feels restrained from committing crimes, that is insane. Yet that is the opinion here. Another thing, and because we're lawyers, we can talk about this, but I think most of your listeners can understand this distinction between the absolute immunity that they offer the President of the United States versus even qualified immunity that they give to cops and other, government officials. Right in the word qualified immunity means, well, it's qualified. That means, well, there's a way to, as we lawyers like to say, pierce the veil of qualified immunity. Maybe you're generally immune, but on this particular situation, Mr. Copper, sir, you're not immune at all. Not so with presidents. Presidents are absolutely immune from everything. And again, with qualified immunity, that only applies to civil cases. That applies to suing them for damages after the fact. It doesn't apply to crimes. Cops can still be charged with murder. Not so with presidents. It's absolute immunity for criminal actions, not civil penalties. It's unhinged. But again, this is what the court has been pretty much since Roberts took control of it.
Which, by the way, and Ellie, I need to have you back because we need to talk some more about it because I'm out of time. But the Roberts being construed as being the moderate is absurd. And that goes out the door because in this particular Roberts court, Chevron gone, homelessness is bad, but SEAL Team 6 is good. And
don't forget, gratuities, also bribery legal now.
But you can do that. It's an official act, right? Bribery. Ellie Yingmestall, thank you. Thank you for being indignant, and thank you for being angry. We need it. We do. Thanks, my friend.
Have the best weekend you can.
Happy. I'm trying, friend.
Thanks for watching The Beat Weekend, and be sure to join us weekdays at 6 p.m. Eastern for The Beat on MSNBC.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.